You know, the cross is probably the most famous symbol in the world, right? But what if the story most of us have heard about it, the one we think we know, actually misses the original revolutionary point? Well, today we're going to dive into a powerful rethinking of the crucifixion based on the work of scholar N.T. Wright to figure out what it all meant on the day a revolution began. To really get this, we have to start with just how shocking the cross was. I mean, the Roman statesman Cicero basically said you didn't even say the word in polite company. This wasn't just a method of execution. It was state-sponsored terror, a brutal public spectacle saved for slaves, rebels, the enemies of the empire. It was Rome's giant, bloody billboard saying, "This is what happens when you mess with us." Yeah, the cross wasn't just an execution method. It was a symbol absolutely packed with meaning. Socially, it screamed that you were worthless human garbage. Politically, it was a declaration, Rome is in charge and you're nothing. And get this, theologically, it was a victory lap for Caesar and the Roman gods over any other god. The cross meant Rome wins, period. Which brings us to this enormous puzzle. How on earth did this instrument of torture, this symbol of imperial violence and complete failure, become the central image for a faith that has literally shaped the world? It's a massive contradiction. It just doesn't make sense on the surface. To answer that, let's first take a look at the most familiar story, the one many of us learned in Sunday school. It's a powerful way of understanding things that's been central to Christian thought for a long, long time. The logic is pretty straightforward. It goes like this. Humanity sins, and that offends a perfectly just God. That justice demands a penalty has to be paid. So Jesus, God's Son, steps in and takes that punishment for us. It's called penal substitution. And the result, we're forgiven and we can escape this broken world and go to heaven when we die. This view really got popular during the Protestant Reformation because it was answering some very specific questions people had back then about salvation. Now here's where it gets really interesting. M.T. Wright comes along and argues that this whole framework, as powerful as it is, actually strips the story of its original first-century Jewish setting. It ends up answering questions the first Christians weren't even asking. So what's the problem? Well, Wright points out a few big ones. For starters, it can accidentally make God look like this angry cosmic figure who just needs to punish somebody to feel better. But even more importantly, he says it de-Judaizes the story. It lifts it out of the grand narrative of the Bible. So instead of a Jewish story, it can start to feel more like a pagan one about calming down an angry God. And finally, it makes salvation all about escaping the world, rather than God's plan to rescue and renew it. So to really get the cross, Wright says we have to put it back where it belongs, inside the epic, sprawling story of Israel and its God. And that story starts way back in Genesis with this idea of the human vocation. See, the original point of humanity wasn't just to be good and follow a list of rules. It was to be God's image bearers, kind of like living statues in God's temple, reflecting his wise and loving rule into the world. We were meant to be a royal priesthood, taking care of creation on God's behalf. So if that's the job, then the core problem isn't just about breaking a few moral laws here and there. It's something much, much deeper: idolatry. That's when we humans flip our job upside down. Instead of reflected God's goodness into the world, we give our loyalty and worship to things within the world: money, power, nations, even ourselves. And the biblical word for the consequence of idolatry is exile. Now, this isn't just about being kicked out of your home country. Exile is the Bible's huge metaphor for the entire human condition. It's a state of slavery to the very idols we chose to worship. It's a kind of spiritual death, completely cut off from our true purpose. Okay, this is where the story gets really exciting. The Bible is always looking back to the first Exodus, when Israel was rescued from slavery to Pharaoh in Egypt. But the prophets, they started talking about a new Exodus, a much bigger rescue. This time, the enemy wouldn't be some human king, but the cosmic powers of sin and death themselves. And the slavery wasn't just in Egypt, it was the slavery of all humanity to idolatry. The goal? Not just freedom for one nation, but for the entire world. And all of this brings us right to the main event. In this way of telling the story, the cross isn't some horrible tragedy that we have to explain away. No, it's the starting gun for a revolution. It is the moment of victory. So, let's be absolutely clear what this perspective is saying. The crucifixion was not some kind of cosmic business deal designed to satisfy the anger of a distant, wrathful God. Instead, it was the decisive battle in a very long war. It was the moment where the true enemies, those enslaving powers that hold humanity captive, were finally and utterly defeated. So what are these powers? Well, it's not just about demons in a supernatural sense. Wright describes them as the forces that we humans, through our idolatry, have handed power over to. Think of Mammon, the corrupting force of wealth, or Mars, the brutal logic of war and violence, or even the dehumanizing systems we build. And behind them all stand the twin tyrants, sin and death. And look, this isn't some new idea. It's right there in the text. As this quote from John's Gospel shows, the very first Christians saw Jesus' crucifixion, his being lifted up, as the exact moment that the ruler of this world was defeated and kicked out. The cross wasn't a defeat, it was an enthronement.
Okay, so if the cross was a victory, a revolution, what does that actually mean for us? How does it change anything in the real world?
Well, the first thing to get your head around is that this isn't just about a ticket to the afterlife. A revolution that defeats the fundamental powers of corruption and death doesn't just change your final destination. It's meant to redefine your entire reality, right here, right now. Wright talks about our deepest human longings as broken signposts. We all long for justice, but it's so often frustrating and corrupt. We long for power, but it always seems to turn into domination and violence. We long for freedom, but we just find new ways to be enslaved. The cross mends these signposts. At the cross, true justice is revealed as restorative, not just about punishment. True power is redefined as self-giving love, and true freedom is shown to be liberation from our idols, not just liberation to do whatever we want.
So let's just put it as plainly as possible. The point of this entire biblical story, with the cross at its center, is not about finding an escape hatch from a doomed planet. The goal of the revolution is so much more ambitious. It's about breaking the grip of those enslaving powers. It's about forgiving our sins to end our state of exile and bring us home. It's about setting humanity free to finally pick up our original job as God's image bearers. And it's not creating a royal priesthood of rescued people who can now join in with God's project of healing and renewing creation itself. Because ultimately, the revolution of the cross is about one thing: launching God's kingdom, not somewhere else, not in some disembodied future, but right here, on earth as it is in heaven. The cross wasn't the end of the world, it was the beginning of the new one. And that leaves us with a final, provocative question. If the cross wasn't just a spiritual transaction for a future heaven, but the D-Day of a revolution meant to remake and restore this entire world, what does that mean for how we are supposed to live right now in the middle of it all? That's the question this incredible story leaves us with.